Imagine looking out your window, expecting to see the daily bustle of a city, merchants, carts, the rhythm of life. Instead, you see a stage. And on that stage, a performance of pure, unadulterated madness that no one asked for, yet everyone is forced to watch. You're not just a bystander anymore. You're a witness to the moment a city decides to dance with its own destruction. If you are watching this right now, I want to ask you something. How much of history do you think is actually true? Because what you are about to hear was never meant to reach you. These are the classified files, the buried evidence, and the forbidden stories that powerful forces spent decades trying to erase. If you are someone who refuses to accept the official story, you are in the right place. Subscribe to the Dark History Files and join thousands of truth seekers uncovering what history tried to hide. Welcome back. This is the Dark History Files, and today we expose a truth that was never meant to be told. Across Strasbourg, windows morphed into silent vantage points overlooking the unfolding anomaly. Shutters stood agape, drawing residents to watch the streets below. Doorways teemed with curious onlookers. Merchants hovered by their stalls, travelers halted, and clergy found their paths obstructed by the mounting spectacle. While the dancers reclaimed the thoroughfares, a secondary population emerged, observers tethered to the periphery, measuring the impossible before them. For these witnesses, the experience became a dissonance of the familiar and the alien. The city's pulse persisted, bells tolled, voices filtered through stone, and market life ebbed and flowed. Yet, woven into this mundane tapestry was the relentless, rhythmic motion of the dancers. Viewed from above, the event manifested as a visual haunting, a stark rupture in the expected order of household life. With time, observation crystallized into a communal ritual. Residents congregated at windows and thresholds, drawn by the shared necessity of witnessing. Brief remarks sparked deeper discourse. One pointed to a recognizable neighbor caught in the trance. Another relayed rumors gathered from distant corners. Through these exchanges, the observers coalesced into a network of inquiry, mirroring the restless motion of the crowd they studied. Watching is never a passive endeavor. Every witness projected their own morality, trauma, and faith onto the scene. One felt sympathy, another alarm. A traveler sought parallels in distant lore, while the clergy scrutinized the chaos for divine portents. From every frame, the citizens of Strasbourg did more than merely observe a mystery. They laid bare the human instinct to impose meaning upon a world that defies explanation. From upper-story windows, the dancers seemed a permanent fixture of the cityscape. Residents returned repeatedly to find the spectacle unceasing, transforming fleeting glances into prolonged vigils. Some leaned heavily on timber frames, while others retreated into the interior shadows, marking the passage of time. Throughout Strasbourg, an untold number of eyes remained locked upon the unfolding tragedy. Merchants occupied a unique vantage point. Bound to their storefronts, they witnessed the evolution of the crisis firsthand. Amidst trade and inventory, they tracked the crowd's expansion, their perspective hardened by continuity. Unlike the transient visitor, the merchant perceived the subtle, rhythmic shifts of the phenomenon from one dawn to the next. Travelers encountered the madness with no warning. Entering the city for trade or passage, they were suddenly thrust into a landscape dominated by reports of the afflicted. To the outsider, the event was a jarring rupture, devoid of local context. Carrying these accounts upon their departure, they served as unwitting conduits, broadcasting the mystery far beyond the city ramparts. Families, too, were drawn into the audience. From domestic sanctuaries, they debated the unfolding horror. Children posed questions that elders could not resolve. The elderly scoured their memories for precedents, grasping for familiar patterns to explain the inexplicable. Yet, in this 16th century world, no comparison sufficed. The void of understanding remained total. The act of watching forged a collective atmosphere. Windows remained open, not merely to escape the summer heat, but to feed an insatiable curiosity. Witnesses exchanged impressions and opinions, weaving the mystery into the city's social fabric. Though they did not join the dance, their scrutiny bestowed a grim significance upon it. Strasbourg watched in unity, trapped in a silent, widening vigil from doorways and shadows. The clergy occupied a singular position among the witnesses. While they traversed the same streets, their office compelled a different scrutiny. Listening to the accounts of parishioners and surveying the throngs, they pondered forces beyond the physical realm. In the 16th century, where spiritual currents dictated the mundane, such an event inevitably invited reflection upon the unseen powers governing human life. Meanwhile, citizens interpreted the crisis through the lens of lived experience. A craftsman watching from a workshop doorway perceived the scene differently than an official. A widow observing from above prioritized concerns invisible to others. This diversity of perspective ensured that no singular explanation took hold. Rather, a citywide discourse flourished, defined by fragmented interpretations and pervasive uncertainty. The architecture of Strasbourg fueled this culture of surveillance. Narrow lanes kept the spectacle in constant view from nearby dwellings. Upper windows served as balconies to the unfolding drama, allowing residents to monitor the chaos without abandoning their chores. Whether preparing meals or mending garments, the citizens integrated observation into their daily rhythm, ensuring the mystery haunted their homes without fully halting the machinery of life. Heightened attention soon altered behavior. Witnesses gravitated toward the most unobstructed views, sparking discourse between neighbors sharing a vantage point. Informal networks of communication emerged, relaying events to those who had missed the day's developments. While the dancers stood at the center, a secondary community formed around them, a populace tethered by the shared burden of observing the unthinkable. This stage of the narrative remains profound. History often prioritizes the act, yet it is equally defined by those who remain to witness it. The onlookers of Strasbourg preserved the event through their focus long before chroniclers etched it into parchment. Their collective curiosity, dread, and confusion imbued the atmosphere. By transforming private sightings into shared knowledge, they woven the mystery into the city's permanent memory, expanding its shadow with every passing day. Witnessing became a daily ritual. Residents returned to their windows each morning, seeking evidence of change. Others paused their labor to monitor the streets. This pattern of return was compulsive. Every observation held the promise of discovery, even as definitive answers remained out of reach. Confusion and fascination coexisted. Witnesses harbored profound concern for the afflicted, yet remained tethered by the gravity of the enigma. These emotions were not mutually exclusive. Watching neighbors descend into incomprehensible behavior lent the spectacle a harrowing complexity that transcended mere curiosity. The dancers were not performers, but kin, whose suffering raised intolerable questions. The light of day dictated the character of the tragedy. Morning revealed distinct details, while the deepening shadows of evening cast the streets in a different, more somber hue. A bustling market provided one context, a quiet sunset another. The mystery remained immutable, yet its presentation shifted in tandem with the city's temporal rhythm. For many, the relentless expansion of the phenomenon defied all logic. Typically, anomalies fade. This one gathered momentum. The more the populace watched, the more immense the spectacle became. Witnesses possessed clarity regarding the present, yet they remained blind to the trajectory. The future had become a void, and the city braced for what might follow. Strasbourg drifted into a state of collective suspense. There was no proclamation to await, only the unfolding, day-by-day progression of the unknown. Windows remained stations of observation, and doorways framed the faces of the wary. Through this sustained focus, the phenomenon evolved into a shared ordeal. Strasbourg had become a city not only defined by its mystery, but by the act of watching itself unravel in real time. By this stage, the witnesses had become integral to the unfolding tragedy. While the dancers held the stage, the surrounding reactions defined the city's atmosphere. Every glance from a window, every hushed exchange at a doorway, and every shared observation layered the collective trauma. The mystery had transcended the afflicted, permeating the consciousness of a populace that remained, for now, at rest. Most striking was the ordinariness of the observers. Merchants, families, travelers, and clergy each viewed the phenomenon through the prism of their own experience. No singular narrative emerged. Strasbourg was not united by clarity, but by the shared, agonizing struggle to decipher an event that defied reason. The act of watching dismantled the barrier between private and public life. Windows that once framed domestic normalcy now opened onto a historical enigma. Household chores persisted, meals were prepared, inventory was tallied, yet attention drifted constantly to the streets below. The mystery infiltrated the home, embedding itself in the mental landscape of the city. As weeks passed, witnesses forged their own archives. Some held on to specific faces. Others remembered the sheer scale of the surging crowd. These fragmented memories served as the first, visceral records of the crisis, long before the first historian took up a pen. Human memory, though flawed, acted as the vital vessel preserving the event's grim reality. Across the expanse of centuries, history tends to fixate on the dancers, ignoring those who stood in the shadows. Yet, the witnesses reveal the true architecture of a mystery. Extraordinary events are not isolated. They are anchored by those who observe, interpret, and remember. In Strasbourg, the dance continued, but it was witnessed by a legion of questioning minds. From workshops and markets to shaded windows, the city watched. In that collective vigil, confusion and fascination were etched into the story that history would eventually preserve. The silence of the council chambers is replaced by the hollow, discordant notes of the musicians, a desperate lullaby for a dying city. As the dancing throng swelled, eyes turned toward the authorities of Strasbourg. Officials synthesized reports and observations while physicians were summoned to diagnose a malady that defied medical precedent. Though cloaked in authority, these men confronted the same visceral reality as any citizen. The relentless motion in the streets and the mounting dread of the onlookers. The challenge was urgent. The city demanded action. For these custodians of order and health, the task transcended mere observation. They weighed testimonies, synthesized citywide reports, and debated in hushed administrative chambers. While the rhythms of daily life persisted outside, a different atmosphere curdled within these meetings. Queries circulated, possibilities were measured. The mystery had infiltrated the halls of power and medicine, where ambiguity demanded not just contemplation, but accountability. As days bled into one another, observation gave way to intervention. The expansion of the dancers signaled a phenomenon that would not self-correct. Leaders could no longer remain passive. Physicians proposed remedies rooted in the era's fallible knowledge. while officials balanced these theories against the volatile needs of the populace. A mandate began to crystallize. The city transitioned from bewilderment toward the threshold of organized response. Yet, a profound deficiency remained. Understanding and control are distinct. While authority possessed influence, it lacked certainty. Every strategy rested upon incomplete theories. Viewed across the chasm of centuries, this moment remains poignantly human. Faced with the inexplicable, those in power clawed for clarity using the limited tools of their time. They were not solving a mystery. They were trapped within it, seeking a path forward as the dance persisted through the summer heat. Strasbourg's 16th century physicians interpreted the enigma through the prevailing medical doctrines of their era. Their framework, anchored in the delicate balance of bodily humors, dictated their diagnostic approach. Observing the dancers, these men sought not modern terminology, but validation through long-established medical traditions. To them, the crisis was a puzzle solvable by the wisdom of generations. As evidence mounted, doctors scrutinized the relentless exertion and the contagion spread, seeking to force these behaviors into known pathological patterns. The task was formidable. The phenomenon mirrored few common ailments. Where familiar symptoms usually yielded predictable explanations, this case offered only obfuscation, leaving the bridge between observation and diagnosis profoundly fractured. City administrators balanced different burdens. While physicians parsed the pathology, officials weighed the systemic disruption to public order. The swelling crowds hindered commerce and fractured civic routines, transforming a medical curiosity into an urgent governance crisis. They required actionable data, balancing medical counsel against the escalating reality of a city under duress. Consultations intensified. Information bled across the boundaries of medicine, faith, and administration. Each faction offered its own lens, creating a nexus of collective inquiry. Strasbourg wrestled with an event that permeated every social strata, yet no single perspective offered a resolution. The city's intellectual resources collided, yet the core mystery remained undisturbed. The sincerity of their efforts remained striking. Authorities did not retreat. They applied every intellectual tool at their disposal to confront the unknown. While modern science still debates the dancing plague, the burden on the officials and physicians of 1518 was peerless. Facing a reality that defied their worldview, they struggled to impose order upon chaos, a testament to the enduring human impulse to find meaning in the unpredictable. As physicians scrutinized the afflicted, a specific diagnosis took hold: an excess of hot blood. Within the rigid framework of humoral theory, this logic proved compelling. The summer heat and the dancers' relentless motion seemed to confirm this imbalance. To 16th century minds, such reasoning was not merely speculative. It was the accepted culmination of medical tradition. Once established, this explanation dictated the course of action. Civic leaders deferred to medical expertise, prioritizing practical solutions over symbolic gestures. If the ailment stemmed from internal combustion, the afflicted required a venue to vent their excess heat. While the rationale appears paradoxical today, it possessed a grim, internal consistency within the intellectual landscape of 1518 Strasbourg. This interpretation marked a critical pivot. Initial bewilderment now surrendered to intervention. Discourse shifted from the nature of the phenomenon to the mechanics of the response. Faced with a contagion that showed no signs of abating, officials felt the weight of their office. Passive observation was no longer tenable. Yet, apprehension lingered. Even those in power could not harbor total confidence. With no modern diagnostic tools to validate their theory, authorities relied upon judgment and fallible experience. This remains a universal human struggle, the necessity of action in the absence of certainty. They were forced to move before they truly understood. In retrospect, this moment exposes the dangerous intersection of belief and governance. The authorities' response was bound by the intellectual constraints of their era. They operated within the only logic available to them. They were not neglectful, but trapped by the limitations of their time, searching for a rational path through the irrational. As the dancers continued their march, the city prepared for a remedy that would be as strange as the affliction itself. Armed with a medical diagnosis, Strasbourg's leaders transitioned toward intervention. The dancers were no longer viewed as isolated victims, but as the catalyst for a citywide crisis. Officials faced the precarious task of balancing public order with the mandates of humoral medicine. Every measure taken carried repercussions, destined to shape not only the afflicted but the entire community bearing witness to the chaos. The authorities functioned within a hierarchy where expertise was paramount. Physicians served as the primary architects of interpretation, providing a framework for the inexplicable. Strasbourg's leadership deferred to this authority, a standard practice in 16th century Europe when confronting phenomena beyond the pale of common understanding. The dancing plague demanded a response, and officials sought it through the sanctioned wisdom of the era. As deliberations deepened, practical dilemmas mounted. How could a city manage a contagion that refused to wane? How were the afflicted to be aided without compromising civic stability? These were not academic inquiries, but operational necessities. Markets, plazas, and thoroughfares, the very arteries of urban existence, were becoming entangled with the relentless movement of the crowd. The decision-making process was a composite of observation, consultation, and judgment. Leaders synthesized physician recommendations, witness testimonies, and personal scrutiny. Yet, despite this data, clarity remained unreachable. Describing the crisis was simple, diagnosing it was a burden. The authorities were forced to navigate a course of action while the truth remained shrouded in shadow. This chapter underscores a recurring human condition. Leaders must act long before the truth is revealed. Perfect understanding is a luxury the unfolding reality rarely affords. The officials of Strasbourg, besieged by a mystery that defied their worldview, felt the heavy hand of duty. Their deliberations, steeped in the cultural and medical assumptions of 1518, were the precursors to actions that would echo through history, leaving posterity to grapple with a legacy of fascination and endless debate. By the summer of 1518, Strasbourg's authorities had transitioned from passive observation to direct intervention. Physicians had rendered their diagnoses, and officials had debated the ramifications. The crisis had breached the sanctity of council chambers, transforming from a street-level anomaly into a formal governance challenge. Inaction was no longer a viable policy. The city demanded resolution. The intrigue of this era lies not in the authorities' resolve, but in their pervasive uncertainty. Modern narratives often project an air of command onto historical figures, yet power confers no monopoly on wisdom. Strasbourg's leaders faced the same confounding voids as their constituents. Responsibility did not grant them clarity. Their decisions were merely desperate attempts to navigate circumstances that defied all logic. The physicians, too, must be judged by the constraints of their century. They were not dismissive of evidence, but bound by the intellectual traditions of early 16th century medicine. Their guidance mirrored theories they held to be objective truth. While hindsight exposes the limitations of their science, to the observers of 1518, their recommendations represented a rigorous attempt to comprehend the impossible. As discourse matured, A mandate for intervention coalesced. The phenomenon had metastasized beyond the threshold of a fleeting curiosity. Deliberations were destined to transcend the meeting room. The city stood at the brink of a new chapter where administrative decree would dictate the fate of both the afflicted and the witness. Strasbourg braced for action, justified by a logic that felt sound within the context of its time. Across the expanse of centuries, this period serves as a solemn reminder of the nature of knowledge. Every era frames the world through its own intellectual glass. The officials and physicians of 1518 reacted with the tools at their disposal, consulting experts, debating outcomes, and striving for order. Their efforts captured both the tenacity and the vulnerability of their age. As the dancers haunted the summer streets, the authorities prepared their response. A series of decisions that would endure as the most chilling and inexplicable legacy of the dancing plague. The stage is set, the music is playing, and the city has unwittingly become a theater of its own destruction. Strasbourg's landscape soon underwent a chilling transformation. Timber platforms rose in the squares, providing staging grounds for the afflicted. Musicians were commissioned to accompany the movement, transmuting a spontaneous tragedy into a structured performance. The city's anatomy shifted. The scattered, aimless wandering was now corralled into designated arenas of motion. The atmosphere curdled. Amidst the mundane hum of the market, the discordant strains of instruments began to echo. Melodies drifted over the crowds, blending the artifice of performance with the grim reality of the mania. Music, typically the herald of joy, here served a haunting purpose. It was a fusion of the familiar and the grotesque, leaving witnesses caught in a deeply unsettling dissonance. Authorities had ceased to be mere observers. They were now active orchestrators, acting on medical counsel that perpetual motion might purge the affliction. City leaders facilitated the dance. A subtle, sinister shift had occurred. The city was no longer attempting to solve the mystery. It was now complicit in its evolution, fostering the very madness it sought to cure. To modernize, this intervention appears as a perversion of logic. Yet, history demands we view it through the lens of the era. The leadership harbored no desire to manufacture a spectacle. They were pursuing a rational remedy derived from the limited medical dogma of their time. Beneath the horror lies a familiar human reflex, the desperate turn to authority when confronted with the unknown. In Strasbourg, that reliance birthed one of the most haunting responses in the annals of the dancing plague. The decision to facilitate rather than suppress the dancing birthed a scene unparalleled in history. While authorities typically seek to contain disorder, Strasbourg chose a different path. Following contemporary medical counsel, officials determined that the dancers must exhaust their affliction to recover. This logic followed the era's belief that internal imbalances demanded a physical purge, an excess that required expression rather than restraint. To execute this strategy, the city transformed its public spaces. Stages were erected and musicians commissioned to sustain the momentum. The phenomenon, once scattered, assumed a structured form. Residents recognized the authorities as active architects of the crisis. The city was no longer a passive witness, but an active participant, maneuvering public policy to dictate the outcome of a medical enigma. Musicians occupied a surreal role. Their presence was not for amusement, but a functional intervention. Instruments typically reserved for celebration now soundtracked a tragedy. This jarring dissonance, the notes of festivity played against a backdrop of bewilderment, defined the oppressive atmosphere that choked Strasbourg during the outbreak. For the afflicted, the stage and the music fundamentally altered their reality. The city codified their condition through public intervention. They were no longer marginalized. but centered within an organized ritual. As crowds watched and officials monitored, the mania became integrated into the urban fabric. Streets once defined by trade were now consumed by this harrowing synthesis of medicine, governance, and public theater. Modern observers naturally recoil at the strangeness of this response. Yet, for those involved, these measures were a sincere attempt to resolve a desperate crisis. Officials acted not with malice, but with conviction, adhering to the medical orthodoxies of their time. The outcome remains a landmark of the dancing plague. Strasbourg had reached a point where music, medicine, and policy converged, a legacy that continues to baffle historians more than 5 centuries later. With the stages established and musicians in place, Strasbourg entered a grim new phase. The phenomenon was no longer autonomous. It was now bound by official decree. Public squares transformed into focal points where the dance became a convergence of performance, medical ritual, and civic policy. Those present could scarcely grasp how grotesque this intervention would appear to posterity. The dynamic between spectator and subject shifted. Observers, once distant watchers at windows or thresholds, now congregated around these designated arenas. This centralization altered the nature of the witness. Dancers remained the focus, yet the architecture of the response, the timber stages, the discordant music, the gathered masses, forged a singular, dominating spectacle that eclipsed the city's normalcy. For officials, these arenas were a testing ground for their chosen strategy. The premise was singular. Exhaustive movement would eventually yield relief. Each dawn brought new scrutiny. Authorities monitored participation, comparing the state of the afflicted against their hopes for recovery. It was a pragmatic effort to quantify results within the narrow limits of 16th century science, waiting for validation that remained elusive. Yet, uncertainty remained an omnipresent specter. The dancers continued their path, their condition defying the structure imposed upon them. While the city had achieved a sense of direction, progress remained an illusion. Citizens observed the platforms and heard the music, yet the efficacy of these measures stayed unproven. The void between administrative intention and the reality of the crisis remained gaping. Strasbourg was trapped in an experiment whose outcome was far from certain. This moment in the plague's history is profoundly telling. Humans instinctively impose structure upon chaos to render it manageable. The stages were such a construct. They forced a wild, incomprehensible phenomenon into an orderly display. Music provided rhythm, and official sanction provided a veneer of purpose. These elements fostered the illusion that the city had mastered the crisis. Whether the remedy would prevail was immaterial. For now, Strasbourg pressed forward, steered by hope, anchored in archaic medical dogma, and haunted by the melodies accompanying an enigma that stubbornly refused to reveal its source. The stages evolved into symbols of the city's desperate bid for order. These physical structures served as grim testimony to the authorities' chosen path. To the residents, they were more than timber platforms. They were manifestations of a belief that action, aligned with medical orthodoxy, could quell the chaos. Wood and labor were repurposed into tools of a state-sanctioned strategy, launched against an enigma that mocked conventional wisdom. Musicians became inextricably bound to the outbreak's reality. Their role underwent a chilling evolution, from the heralds of festivity to instruments of perceived therapy. Music served as the heartbeat of the recovery effort, blurring the lines between art, medicine, and public policy. The distinction between joy and contagion dissolved, with performance acting as a functional component of a broader, systemic response. Meanwhile, citizens assessed the intervention through their own lens. Some clung to the optimism of official policy, while others remained paralyzed by doubt. Human response is rarely uniform. Conclusions diverged based on personal experience and unspoken dread. Throughout Strasbourg, the populace scrutinized the same stages, yet arrived at a fractured spectrum of opinions regarding their efficacy. Time became the final arbiter. Initial decisions, sound in their inception, required the crucible of duration to prove their worth. Authorities, having exhausted their counsel, now joined the citizenry in a tense, silent vigil. Every passing day provided data for the unfolding narrative. Residents measured the present against the recent past, scouring for signs of salvation or the emergence of unforeseen consequences. This period remains a study of a city suspended between conviction and fear. Officials had committed to their course, yet the outcome lay shrouded in the unknown. The dancers moved, the musicians played, and the witnesses watched. Amidst the persistent routines of life, Strasbourg participated in one of the most haunting public health interventions in history. They had embraced a remedy that felt rational to their era, leaving time to render the final, irrevocable verdict. As summer reached its zenith, the authorities' response became the defining artifact of the outbreak. Timber stages dominated public squares, musicians played their relentless tunes, and the dancers held the city in a trance. What began as an inexplicable affliction had mutated into a structured, civic enterprise. The phenomenon was no longer autonomous. It was now bound to the deliberate, calculated decisions of those striving for a resolution. For the citizens of Strasbourg, this created a surreal reality. Daily life did not retreat from the madness. It coexisted with it. Merchants traded, travelers passed through the gates, and families sustained their routines, all within the shadow of this orchestrated intervention. The contrast was harrowing. The mundane rhythm of existence intertwined with a calculated, public experiment in the sweltering heat of midsummer. This response exposed the anatomy of how a society confronts the unknown. Faced with a crisis that mocked explanation, the leadership chose intervention over paralysis. Their policy was forged from the most credible reasoning of the era. They sought medical counsel, embraced expert guidance, and enacted measures intended to purge the malady. Regardless of the strategy's efficacy, their resolve to act rather than witness in silence remains the salient truth. To the modern mind, the notion that movement could cure movement appears paradoxical. Yet, history frequently defies our contemporary logic. The citizens of 1518 navigated an intellectual framework governed by traditions we have long abandoned. Within that world, the intervention possessed a compelling internal consistency. Acknowledging this does not demand consensus with their methods, only an understanding of the context that birthed them. As this chapter draws to a close, Strasbourg stands revealed as a city grappling with its own shadow. Officials had spoken, musicians had been summoned, and platforms had been raised. The dancers continued their march before an audience gripped by dread and anticipation. Yet, despite the frenzy of activity, the core mystery remained untouched. The intervention had altered the landscape, but it had not delivered the truth. The enigma persisted, propelled through the summer by the beat of the music and the fading hope of a cure that remained forever out of reach. The city has built a stage for its own undoing, but as the music swells to a fever pitch, the dancers aren't getting better. They are simply becoming part of the architecture of the nightmare. The next part is coming in just 48 hours.